Comrades, I want to say at the beginning, this is the hardest talk I've ever had to prepare, because really when I started reading about it, I realized how little I knew, and by the time I finished reading about it, and I had to write the talk, I realized even more how little I knew, so that part of the discussion ought to be, well, I hope additions to what I have to say, as well as merely controversion, but anyway. I have read some very interesting books in the process, and since I thought I might as well share my knowledge as much as I can, since I'm a poly lecturer, I did the usual thing. There's a handout if anybody would like it at the end. Okay, now the problem is this that we have to deal with. It's the problem of the transition from one mode of production to another. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on the term mode of production, though I have to say something further about it later on, but essentially the term refers to a combination of a set of forces of production, productive forces on the one side, and a set of social relations of production on the other, combined together, and having a particular set of laws of motion, or patterns of development, inherent in them. The problem is to explain the emergence out of one mode of production with one set of laws of motion, how out of that there develops another mode of production, namely capitalism. Capitalism is characterized by the constant revolutionization of the forces of production, as Marx describes it in the Communist Manifesto. Rising productivity of labor characterizes the capitalist mode of production. Now, it's not true of the feudal mode of production, and we have to explain how one system becomes another. So really, what I want to talk about are three questions. Firstly, what was the feudal mode of production, and how was it different from the capitalist mode of production? That's the first question. Second one, how did the capitalist mode of production emerge out of it? And that's the area of greatest difficulty, obviously. And thirdly, a question which I think we also need to ask, which I at least want to touch on, which is what did the feudal mode of production bequeath, in a sense, to the capitalist mode of production? Now, I'm going to have to oversimplify enormously, and for those of you who are rather better read in medieval and early modern history than I am, you will spot all my oversimplifications and so on, but I want to try and catch what seemed to me to be, on the basis of what I've read, the main points. Okay, let's start with the feudal mode of production. And firstly, I think it's necessary to say that we need to restrict that term, certainly for the purposes of this discussion, to what existed in Europe after the collapse of the Roman Empire. And when I'm talking about the feudal mode of production, what I have to say does not apply to other pre-capitalist modes of production, or pre-capitalist systems. There's a whole argument about whether the feudal mode of production as a term can be applied other than in Europe. In the way in which I'm going to use it, I think it can only be restricted to Europe. Now, what were the characteristics then of the European feudal mode of production? We ought to begin, I think, where Marx suggests beginning the discussion of any mode of production, with the process of exploitation, with the relationships within which exploitation takes place. Now, 90% of the population of Europe in the medieval period lived in the countryside. It was a rural population. And it was in the rural areas that the main dynamics of the feudal mode of production, the main laws of motion of the feudal mode of production were really determined. The key figures in this process are two figures. We can call them on the one side lords, and on the other side peasants. They are the key central figures in the feudal mode of production, just as capitalists and workers in the capitalist mode of production are the key figures. The peasants, because of the way in which land was held, because of the pattern of agriculture, because of the way in which the forces of production were used, the peasants directed the process of production to all intents and purposes themselves. They had, as Marx puts it at one point, possession of the means of production. Not that they owned them, but that they actually controlled the actual day-to-day process of production, which is not, of course, true of the worker in capitalist society, but it was true of the feudal peasant. The implication of this is that the lords who exploited them stood outside the immediate process of production. And if they were to, in fact, I should just say there are two sorts of lords, in a sense. One sort we could call secular lords, with names like Earl, or Sir Gobbledygook, or the Lord of this, or the Count of that, or whatever. They're the secular lords. On the other side, there are religious lords, as it were. The Bishop of Nottingham, famous from Robin Hood, or the priest, or the abbot of such and such an abbey. The church owns a large part of the land, either through the bishop chain or through the monastery chain. In fact, in England at the time of the Doomsday Book, it owned something like 28% of the agricultural land in England. So there are two sorts of lords. Not that it makes any difference from the point of view of the lords, from the point of view of the peasants, who fight both kinds of lords anyway in much the same sort of way. Both of these kinds of lords are outside the immediate process of production, and therefore, in order to get surplus out of the peasants, they had to use what Marx called extra economic coercion as a mechanism for the extraction of surplus from the peasants. Ultimately, their ability to squeeze surplus out of the peasants depended on their ability to use force. Hence, they are an armed class. And the peasantry is subjected to them and to their law, to their jurisdiction and so on, and that is the mechanism by which the lordly class extracts surplus fundamentally from the peasants. And they collect what is sometimes called feudal rent. But what I'm going to follow the language of a French Marxist called Guibois, and call it levy, to distinguish it from any of the terms we use in capitalism. They extract levies from the peasantry in different sorts of forms. There are different particular ways in which they do it. They collect labour services from them. They collect part of the product from them. They sometimes take money from them. They have peasants who are serfs. Some of the peasants are serfs. Those who are serfs, if they want to get married, they have to pay a license fee called a fine to their local lord for permission to marry. Now you have to pay a whole series of different fines to your lord, rather like having to license your dog. Under the state today, you had to go to your local lord to get permission to do this and that. In each case, you had to pay a payment to the lord. All sorts of fines, therefore, in the lord's courts. And there are various other things called tallages, or in French, the taille, which is essentially an arbitrary tax which the lord imposes at different times if he can get away with it on the peasants. There are tithes which the church collects, 10% of the product to go to the church, and so on. A whole series of extractive processes from the peasants by which the lords accumulate surplus from them. Now, at this point, some theorists stop. They say, well, we've described the relations of exploitation, and that's enough to define the mode of production. And I think that that's quite incorrect. You can't define a mode of production simply in terms of the immediate process of exploitation. You certainly can't if you think about capitalism. You can't define capitalism simply in terms of the extraction of surplus value from workers. You also have to talk about the relationships of competition between the different capitalists which force them into a permanent process of accumulation, reinvestment, and so on. The relationships between the capitalists define in part the relations of production of capitalism. Similarly, I want to argue in relation to feudalism. You also have to argue, I think, rather perhaps more controversially, you actually have to include at least aspects of the state in the definition of the capitalist mode of production. Otherwise we wouldn't be able to understand such things as state capitalism, for example. Equally, I want to suggest when we come to it that the same is true of the state. Now, the European feudal mode of production, then, is not only characterized by these processes of extraction of surplus from the peasants, but also by a particular pattern of organization of the ruling class. And fundamentally, it's a pattern of disorganization of the ruling class, or a disorganized form of organization, which, for example, Perry Anderson calls, if I remember, it's either parcellized, meaning in parcels, or parcellated, I can't remember one of these extraordinary words, parcellated sovereignty, he calls it. The point is that in Europe, under feudalism, there was no single imperial state center. There is no single state center for this particular mode of production. We're not talking about ancient China with an imperial system. We're not talking about the Roman Empire with an imperial center and so on. We're talking about a system without a center, without a political center. Every attempt by one or other part of the ruling class of Europe to form a single center failed. Charlemagne attempted to establish an empire. He failed, or his successors lost what he'd achieved. The papacy at one point looked as if it had aspirations to forming an empire under itself. It failed. The Holy Roman Empire did not survive. The Habsburgs attempted, one might say, to form an empire in Europe, covering the whole of Europe. They all failed. And therefore, all the time when we talk about feudalism, we're talking about a system which has not got a single center, but has multiple centers of states, proto-states, lords warring with each other, and so on. On the other hand, we have also to say at the same time that it was a single system. It was a single system, bound together firstly by the fact that the ruling class shares a common culture, which it has through the church, above all, but also relations of warfare and trade between the different parts of Europe actually make it into a single system. And the reason that we know in part, as I understand it from the historians I've managed to read, that it was a single system is that, for example, the movements of prices and the movements of population up and down in Europe follow similar trends in similar periods right across the whole of Europe. In that sense, we can talk about it as a single system, but without a single centre. It shouldn't be a problem for us. After all, capitalism is a single system without having a single centre either. So that feudalism, in that respect, is in some ways a little bit, not very like capitalism, but in that respect a bit like capitalism. Around the year 1000, before William the Conqueror came and conquered, it was really the case that in Europe there really were no states in the sense in which we recognise states today. As far somebody will then point to my terrible failure to mention one that really did. But by and large the picture is one in which you have a multiplicity of lords and their vassals all across the West European area. A variety of lords, large and small, in various kinds of relationships of interdependence and so on. Now the other thing that has to be said about feudalism, I think, is that this very fact, this multi-centred system amongst the noble class, the ruling class, permitted within itself the growth of trade and permitted the development within itself of the growth of towns and of commodity exchange. Now, two kinds of markets develop, in a sense, within feudal Europe. One is a short-distance market, peasants exchanging products with local market towns and so on in very restricted areas, local produce exchange in a sense, and another one which is not really very integrated with that, which is long-distance trade carried on by merchants and peddlers and so on, trade in luxuries, partly as the towns develop within medieval Europe, partly produced within those towns, partly trade with outside Europe, with Asia and elsewhere. Trade in luxuries, when I say luxuries, we have to remember that I'm using the term luxuries in an economic sense rather than in terms non-productive goods, in a sense. Goods not for immediate consumption or not for immediate use in production, but very important things including weapons, which are also part of this trade system. Weapons and armour and so on. Now, the point of mentioning this is that I think it's necessary to insist that trade and commodity exchange and so on are not external to feudalism in Europe, they're part of it. See, there is a school of writers, beginning I think with Adam Smith in the 18th century, and continuing through into the 20th century with the Belgian writer, historian Pirenne, and also more recently Paul Sweezy in America, who have a tendency to see commodity exchange as something external to feudalism. And therefore they see the rise of commodity exchange as something that breaks feudalism down. And that seems to me improper. Actually, it's a part of feudalism, commodity exchange. Towns are a part of feudalism. Commercial relationships developing is not something that is necessarily opposed to feudalism. It's actually contained within it and part of its very definitions. Okay. Now, what are the laws of motion of this system? They're fundamentally determined. What are the dynamics of development of this feudal system? I think fundamentally they're shaped by the characteristics that I've already tried to outline. And there are really 5 things, I think, if you're making notes and you want to number your points, and I don't know if you like that. 5 things. The first thing is that between the lords and the peasants there is a continuous struggle, varying in degree and varying in intensity at different times and in different places, but a continuous struggle between the lords and the peasants over the question of the levy, over the question of the extraction of surplus. Continuous class struggle right across Europe, all through the period of feudalism, over the question of exploitation. And that's the fundamental process of class struggle within feudalism, between lord and peasant. And it shapes every other process of development within feudalism, it seems to me. What, amongst other things, determines what happens is the degree of political organisation, the pattern of organisation, and the strength of the contending parties in that struggle. So that, for example, in different parts of Europe at the same period, we find the lords being more successful and less successful in extracting surplus from the peasantry. For example, in England, where after the Norman conquest there's a more centralized and better organized noble class under the kings, they are more successful also in extracting surplus from the peasants. And certainly for the servile peasants, Rodney Hilton, for example, reports that 50% of the product of the serfs in England is taken away from them in tribute, as it were, in levy, by the lords in one form or another. They lose half of everything that they produce to the lordly class. On the other hand, Guy Bois reports that in northern France, in Normandy, I'm not saying unfortunately there were no serfs. We're not comparing like with like. This is the problem, because Hilton's figures are for serfs, and there are no serfs, or hardly any serfs left in Normandy by the same period that Hilton is talking about in the 12th and 13th centuries. But Guy Bois says only between 9 and 10% of the total product of the peasants is being taken away in the 13th century by the French lords. In other words, they're much less successful in extracting surplus from the peasants. The peasants are making much more gains from the lords in northern France than is the case in England. That's the first thing. The second thing, then, is that neither the lords nor the peasants, this is not capitalism, neither of the major classes in rural production has any particular necessity to invest, to accumulate surplus and reinvest it in new methods of production. Neither the necessity nor the incentive to do so. You see, the lord's method of increasing surplus is fundamentally to try to squeeze the peasants harder. That's a method of increasing surplus. Try to squeeze more out of the peasant. That's the method. There's no incentive, as far as the lords are concerned, particularly to try to squeeze more out of them in order to reinvest it, in order to squeeze better. What, if anything, they will invest in is better armaments, enlarging their retinues to be able to overawe the peasantry or whatever. That's the method which they will use, but not the method of capital. Secondly, or they will raid each other. The other method which they have for trying to enlarge their surplus is to go to war with each other in order to try to grab a rival's land and a rival's peasants in order to enlarge the number of peasants that they can exploit. The peasants had very little reason to invest, on the other hand, because, after all, any peasant who becomes in these conditions at all rich is liable to be prone to noble exactions or indeed being raided by somebody, and so on and so on. So neither class has really got much of an incentive to improve production. And there's therefore, after the late Dark Ages, as far as I can see, there are some productive developments in agriculture, but not much. Most of the feudal agriculture was much more productive than Roman agriculture. There are a whole series of changes in the Dark Ages, improvements in methods of ploughing, improvements in the organization of the fields, the spreading of the watermill as a method of grinding corn for flour, and so on and so on. Numbers of productive developments, some of which are inherited from the Romans, which the Romans didn't use, are used in feudalism. But in the high feudal period, in a sense, the high Middle Ages, really there's very little new in the way of development of the methods of production. In the towns, there is also nothing very great in terms of technical development. Again, most of the town's production is of luxury goods for a small market, not production for a mass market, but for a small market, for the lordly market, and there is very little incentive there also for the development of new methods of production and the rest of it. So, generally speaking, the pattern of development is not an intensive one where the productivity of labor is increased over the feudal period. Generally speaking, the pattern is rather what could be called an extensive process of development. During the period from the year 1000 to about the end of the 13th century, to coming up to the year 1300, basically the development consisted of more of the same. That's to say, there was extensive colonization. For example, in large numbers of German peasants moved east into Eastern Europe and opened up empty land. Similarly, there was a process called assarting, which was opening up fields in what were formerly woodlands, so that large parts of unused waste area is brought into use. And that's fundamentally the process of growth, extensive rather than intensive. Now, that's the second thing. The third thing is that this process of development has a tendency to run into limits, to run into barriers, and based in a sense upon the tendency of the peasants to over-reproduce themselves, as Hilton puts it, in relation to their means of subsistence. The population tended to rise to a point where it ran up against the barriers of production. And especially, this is worsened in a sense by the fact that the new lands that are opened up are less rich, and so on. There's an opening up of less fertile land. There's a tendency for the peasant farm, on average, to get smaller. And so, towards the end of the 13th century, the early decades of the 14th century, we see a situation in which already the population is running up into its limits, and there's signs of malnutrition, the population begins to level off, and so on and so on. This means that the peasants' ability to pay levies to the lords, at least in principle, declines. Their productivity, certainly in Normandy, for example, the productivity of agriculture on average declines per head. What do the lords do faced with the declining ability of the peasants to pay surplus? They squeeze harder. And so already there's a tendency, if you like, not necessarily to crisis, but to the need for adjustment within the peasant population, which is worsened by the lords increasing exactions, or attempts to increase exactions, from the peasantry. And what would have been perhaps demographic adjustments in the population of feudal Europe is turned in the 14th century into enormous crisis in the population. The peasantry, particularly the poorer peasantry, because the peasantry are not, there's differentiation anyway amongst the peasantry, which there isn't time to go into, but perhaps if anybody wants to raise it, we can come back to it in the discussion. But particularly the smaller peasantry are pauperized in many parts of Europe. There is extensive malnutrition, they are semi-starving, and they are then hit in that condition with famine and plague. First famine and then plague. The Black Death comes to Europe in the middle of the 14th century and wipes out a whole section of the European population. Its effects are various in different parts of Europe. In northern France, one of the most populous areas, 50% of the population is wiped out in a few years by the Black Death. I mean, there are bourgeois historians like Michael Mann and a fellow whose name I can't remember, also at the London School of Bourgeois Economics, who says, talks about even growth from feudalism through to capitalism. It's absolute extraordinary lapse, not to mention the extraordinary collapse of production, the tremendous convulsive crises that affect late feudalism, and which shape the whole future as well. And this crisis suddenly there's a crisis in the labour supply. There's a shrinkage of the lands that are being farmed. There's an emptying of villages. There's a tremendous fall in the population. And the response of the lords across Europe to this crisis is to try to squeeze even harder, to batten down on the peasant. And the period that follows the Black Death is a period where the crisis is deepened even further by war between the lords of various kinds. Famine and plague are succeeded by war. By pillaging of the... War is associated with the pillaging of peasant farms, the pillaging of livestock, and so on and so on. And there's a period which follows from the 1450s roughly for the next century, roughly through most of the 14th century and the early part of the 15th century, of tremendous social upheaval. That's the period of the Peasants' Revolt in England, that's the period of the 100 Years' War, it's the period of the War of the Roses, and so on. And in the central areas, like in Normandy, for example, which there's a superb study, although it's theoretically wrong in some respects, a magnificent description by Guy Bois, French Marxist historian of this period. The population in Normandy fell from the early 14th century to the middle of the 15th century from a situation where at one point there were 10 people, now there were 3 people. I mean, this is, as Guy Bois says, it is like a Holocaust, only it's unintentional. Absolute devastation of the place. The one part, in this situation, the one part of technology that does develop is military technology. There's a continuous tendency, given the tremendous wars that are going on between the different sections of the lordly class in late feudal Europe, there's development of military technology. The old knightly levies, the knights on their horses going and fundamentally conducting the battles, they become outmoded. Firstly, not by anything very modern, but, for example, by English bowmen, strictly Welsh bowmen, who slaughter the French knights, for example, at the Battle of Crécy and finish off the idea that you can conduct a battle with the old levy of feudal knights and so on. It becomes increasingly important in future that armies should be larger, that they should be drawing on the peasantry, on the skills of the peasantry, and later on mercenaries, and so on and so on. So that the military question comes to be an important question in further development. In order to in this situation of massive crisis in Europe, it becomes necessary for the noble classes, or the ignoble classes, in order to control the peasants, and in order to fight each other, and in order to coordinate themselves militarily, they enter into a process of internal reorganization of their forces. The lordly classes go into a tremendous process of reorganization. Now, from here I'm basically following the American Marxist writer Robert Brenner, because he suggests that out of this great crisis, the first great crisis of feudalism, there emerged three major patterns in Europe which set the pattern for the future and shape in some ways the way in which capitalism is to develop. See, firstly, in Eastern Europe, there isn't time to discuss why, and I'm not sufficiently informed probably anyway to discuss why, but what essentially happened in Eastern Europe is that the peasants in Eastern Europe, many of whom had been colonists from the West, who had been very often the freest peasants in Europe in the 13th century, find themselves in the late 14th and 15th century clamped down by their lords in serfdom, what's called the second serfdom in Eastern Europe. And in a sense, Eastern Europe is then set on the path which is inherited from that period of backwardness, economic backwardness in relation to the rest of Europe. That's the first pattern. The second pattern he identifies is one which he sees as happening above all in France, but also to a degree in West Germany. But I think I want to focus on France. I know much less about Western Germany. Here he suggests, and you can already see this in terms of you remember the difference between the level of exploitation in England and in France. It's much lower in France. He suggests that in France the individual lords find themselves relatively weak in relation to the peasants, unable to stop the peasantry maintaining effective property in the land, and hence facing an enormous crisis in their own lordly incomes. In a sense, what helps them to find a solution to this crisis is the fact that the English nobility goes to war in northern France, in the 100 Years' War, and forces them to reorganize, in a sense, around the emerging French state. The state initially of the Capetians, and if I remember rightly, they changed their dynasty at some point, but it doesn't really matter, who cares about kings? But the basis, there's a shift in the basis of the levying of levy on the peasantry. Increasingly, the peasants are subjected to state taxation in France. What is extracted from them by the lords becomes less significant in some ways in the development in France than the extraction of taxes by the state. And the nobility, though they resist this process in various kinds of ways, they also participate in it. There's a long process of struggles between the nobility and the emerging French monarchy over the next couple of centuries, but as France moves towards the absolutist monarchy, as it's called, which is finally fully consolidated in the 17th century. But the French feudal class, the French noble class, the feudal class, shares in the benefits of this centralized state apparatus, firstly because it wins exemption from taxes itself, and all the taxes are loaded onto the peasantry, and secondly because it participates then in the fruits of office. It gets the perks of office, it gets in all kinds of ways. Now, so the French feudal class takes the road, in a sense, towards the absolutist state. And in France, to coin a phrase, I don't think anybody coined it, probably somebody coined it apart from me, but we could talk about a kind of state feudalism developing in France, resting on the continuation of peasant agriculture, subject to now heavy state levies, heavy state taxes, the taille as it's called, and still fundamentally characterized by the same lack of dynamism in the economy. And France is a late developer in terms of capitalism, partly because of this is the way in which the French feudal, the crisis of feudal Europe resolves itself, in a sense, in France, through the very processes of the class struggle between the lords and the peasants above all. And there's a similar pattern in other parts of Europe. Feudalism in crisis, Robert Brenner suggests, revealed a tendency, a developmental tendency, towards what Robert Brenner calls political accumulation. That's his term, political accumulation. I'm not entirely happy with the term, but what he's referring to is a tendency for political centralization of a particular kind, for the building up of states as machines for two things: for war with other states, and also for the suppression of the peasantry, for controlling the peasantry and for competing militarily with other groups of lords in other states. But this process of political accumulation doesn't change the fundamental economic dynamics of the feudal system. And so historians talk about 200 years later as a second general crisis, the general crisis of the 17th century, as it was called in some literature some years ago, in which again we see in Europe in the early 17th century a tendency for the population to fall, famines, the increasing impact of diseases amongst the population, war across most of Europe, as basically a still basically feudal economy runs again into the same pattern of crisis as it had done 250 years before. Except for one thing, and this is the third area that Brenner discusses. In one tin pot little place, right in the corner of all of this, there is England, which, because has the one advantage, it's an island, and as an island it was saved from the ravages of armies, which had an impact, for example, on France, which had an impact on Germany, which had an impact, which I think Mick Brightman mentioned in one of the meetings earlier on during Marxism, in affecting the development of the Low Countries and so on. In England, there is, from the late 15th century onwards, really, a new pattern of development. And again, Brenner's suggestion is that this is the result of a particular balance of class forces, above all between the lords and the peasants. That after the Black Death and the labour shortages that followed the Black Death, there was, of course, an attempt by the lords to load new burdens onto the peasantry. One of the signs of that is the first incomes policy ever launched in England, not, as you might think, by Harold Wilson or even Lord Hume, but actually by the King of England in the 14th century. I think it's called the Statute of Artificers. Anyway, what it basically said was wages are not to rise. It's a crime to raise wages, and peasants managed furiously to evade that, and wages did in fact rise. They were unable to control, for a period, the rise in wages, given the labour shortage. The lords tried to load new burdens and wage limits and so on onto the smaller peasants and so on. That's the background to the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Of course, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was defeated, and there is a moral from the defeat of the Peasants' Revolt of 1381: never trust the king. Especially if he's at Mile End Tube Station. But the serfdom was abolished. The fact of the matter is, as Rodney Hilton shows, that despite the defeat of the Peasants' Revolt, the political battle, if you like, between the peasantry and the aristocracy in England in 1381, nonetheless, although they lost that particular battle, they didn't lose the war, because serfdom effectively is abolished in England over the next half century or so. And some historians have talked about the 15th century in England as being the golden age of the English peasantry, when in fact they are freed from many of the lordly exactions. And there's a crisis in the 15th century in the incomes of lords, which they try partly to resolve by trying to conquer outside in France. They lose all that, thanks to Joan of Arc and all the rest of it. Then they have their own internal wars, the Wars of the Roses. And finally, with cries of, a horse, my kingdom for a horse, William Shakespeare rides onto the scene and saves England for the Tudors. Now, the 1066 and all that. Now, the point is that serfdom disappeared. On the other hand, the English peasantry, although they managed effectively to abolish serfdom and a whole series of feudal levies upon themselves, did not, Brenner argues, win the control of the land. And the land remained fundamentally, unlike in France, in the ownership, as it were, of the nobles. Enough of it, much more of it, remained in the hands of the nobility, and the stronger lords kept the land. And when then, in the later 15th century, in the 16th century, there is an upturn in the European economy, Right across Europe, an upturn associated with such things, amongst others, as the American discoveries and so on. But not only that, the landowners find themselves, on the one hand, blocked by the peasantry. The strength of the peasantry is sufficient to stop them from reasserting arbitrary levies on the peasantry, and they move slowly into a new kind of direction. They move slowly towards becoming capitalist landowners, a different kind of figure. They begin to engage together with the better off peasants, the freeholding peasants, or peasants who've got sufficiently secure tenures and so on. They begin to move the late 15th century, through the 16th century, through the 17th century, through the 18th century. It's a long drawn out process involving tremendous struggles at various points. They move towards the enclosure of land. They move towards the redesign of the English countryside. You know, if you go for a walk in the country thinking that you're communing with nature, you're actually communing with the capitalist class's reorganization of nature over several centuries. All those fields with all those hedges and so on they didn't grow there, thanks to God. Somebody put them there, some capitalist swine. He's now pulling them out again, of course, but that's another question. The economic rent, and they move into a situation in which the wealthier peasants pay them economic rents, market-determined rents, fundamentally, for the land. And the better off peasants become, they get to be called yeoman farmers. And they become capitalist farmers, increasingly producing for the market, often hiring wage labour, increasingly specialising in their production. In different regions of England you get the specialisation of production, of sheep here, corn there, mixed farming elsewhere, dairy farming developing in particular areas around cities of specialist production, and so on and so on. Producing for the market, developing in England from the late 15th century onwards increasingly a capitalist agriculture. Now the various attempts by the peasantry in different struggles to halt that process are defeated, sometimes very bloodily. For example, in 1549 in Kett's Rebellion, in East Anglia, 3,000 peasants are cut down by the English army. And if 3,000 in terms of the population of England at the time, it's like the Battle of the Somme in terms of the destruction of the English population. It's a massive slaughter of the population of East Anglia to stop fundamentally where the issue is the capitalist reorganization of agriculture. The English landlords become capitalist landowners, and they become ready to invest in land, to treat land as something to invest in long term with a view to profit, sometimes in conjunction with their capitalist tenant farmers. And that pattern emerges in England. The outcome is that in England there are slow improvements then in agricultural technique. There is a more secure food supply. This means that there is more space within England for the growth of other kinds of activities, for the freeing of a part of the population from agricultural pursuits. It doesn't mean that everybody immediately leaves the land and rushes off to Manchester to participate in the Industrial Revolution. That isn't to come for a couple of centuries. But there are other activities that develop in the countryside, rural industries. Some villages become industrial villages. Specialized people partly engage in agriculture, partly in wage labour. Proto-industrialization is a term that's been applied to this. But the beginnings of capitalist industry begin not with factories, but with part-time wage labour in various kinds of ways, seasonal wage labour, and so on, supplied often by merchants. There is a food supply to supply those who become increasingly specialized in artisan activities, small crafts, in part-time wage labour activities and so on. There is a food supply for the towns and the rest of it. And England, though there is a shaky period at the end of the 16th century, England never again seriously experiences famine. That is not true of the rest of Europe. You want to compare it, the fundamental comparison I suppose would be somewhere like as backward as Tsarist Russia, whereas late at the end of the 19th century there are massive famines in Tsarist agriculture. Now, by the early 17th century, I think we have to say that England was already well set on the capitalist road. There are very important processes in politics which are still, of course, to occur to consolidate this. Had Charles I succeeded in his struggle with Parliament and established, as he seemed to be attempting to do, an absolutist monarchy in England, ruling without Parliament, seeking to tax the mass of the population, and so on, then it's very likely that the whole process of capitalist development would have been stalled and stopped in England, and the history of the world might have been rather different. But he didn't. He was beaten, of course, and we chopped off his head, and a good thing too. Thereafter, English economic power grew and grew, and England was able, therefore, on the basis fundamentally of its economic strength, to win a whole series of wars in the late 17th century, in the 18th century, and to gain absolute world hegemony, certainly as far as the European and North Atlantic worlds are concerned, particularly in its struggle with the more backward French state, and so on. Now, just to conclude, I think if we look at the process as a whole, I think we can say several things in summary. The first one, there are four things I think, which I just want to say just to conclude. The first one is that the traditional explanation, I'll call it, of capitalist development, which we inherit from Adam Smith, above all, which focused on a rising towns and a rising urban bourgeoisie, puts the emphasis in the wrong place. Now, I'm not wanting to say that towns have no part in all of this process. Apart from the thing is, towns are very important in the definition of feudalism itself. They give feudalism a dynamic which is missing from other kinds of pre-capitalist systems. But they put the emphasis in the wrong place. The medieval towns were not actually hotbeds of nascent capitalism. They were part of the feudal order in many senses. They lived off in many important ways the rural surplus. And when the rural economy went into decline, so did the urban economy. What determined the pattern of feudal development was what happened in the countryside. The new capitalistically organized industries that we see growing up from the 16th century onwards in England, for example, and elsewhere, for that matter, tend to grow up outside the influence of the towns very often. It's necessary very often for capitalists to break with the merchant capitalists who want to develop new kinds of methods of production and so on in cottage industries and the rest of it, who begin to invade the world of production and to organize production and to become capitalist merchants in that sense, in the modern sense. Tend to escape the influence of the guilds in the towns and on the feudal guilds in the towns to move out into the rural areas. The key to capitalist breakthrough, I conclude, really lay in the countryside and not the towns. The real agents of capitalist socio-economic revolution were not so much a merchant bourgeoisie in the towns and so on as the English kulaks or yeoman farmers and the commercializing landowners. The second conclusion I think we have to say is that capitalist development emerged not as the result of some ineluctable law of history, but almost as an accidental byproduct of the processes of class struggle. Above all, those processes of class struggle between lords and peasants in England. In conjunction with the fact that for particular accidental and historical reasons, England had low levels of military taxation and a low degree of absolutist state development. And the development of England then had knock-on effects on the rest of the world, which did not follow the English road towards capitalism. Nowhere else in the world does anybody actually, despite what Marx wrote in the preface to Capital, nowhere else in the world actually is the story told in the same way about the development of capitalism. Third point, the key to capitalist development in England, it seems to me, was the dispossession of the feudal peasantry from control of production. And this really was the key to what Marx called the primitive accumulation of capital, the formation of a proletariat in England. That was the key. The dispossession of the peasantry from the land was the key to the developing formation of capitalist commodity production, to the conversion of wealth into capital, the key to the conversion of wealth into capital, and the key to the expansion of the productivity of labour, which underlies the whole process of capitalist development. And last point, even though feudalism was finally destroyed, I mean, it's not easy to say exactly when it's destroyed. As far as Europe is concerned, it is finally destroyed, perhaps we can say in the 19th century. As more and more countries are forced by economic and military pressures, competitive pressures from the developing countries are forced themselves to convert by revolution from below, by revolution from above, forced to convert onto the capitalist road. European feudalism, nonetheless, has left its mark on the world of capitalism in the shape of the nation-state system of today. Because in the crucible of the crisis of feudalism, the modern nation-state system was formed, and we have inherited that bastard nation-state system and all the problems that go with it to characterize capitalism in the 19th and 20th century. And capitalism has reinforced and developed the nation-state system and used it for its own purposes, you might say, and given it new forms like state capitalism and so on and so on. And I think we have to say that the way in which we will finally abolish that inheritance of feudalism, the system of competing bureaucratic nation-states in the world, is through the socialist revolution. Thank you. I can't answer, and it sounds like the simplest one. The Americans come right at the beginning to ask me about the Treaty of Westphalia. I can spell Westphalia. I believe you when you say what. Well, the problem is I'm not a historian, and I stand before you. I should have said that at the beginning, and should have all left anyway. I read all that I could read in the time that was allowed to me, and above all I tended to focus on social and economic history, and the details of the political events of the process I don't know, and therefore I apologise for the fact that I can't answer the question, but Nora, who's sitting here, can, and speak to her afterwards. Now, also from John, who said nice one. Now, the question about the church being a relic of feudalism, well, not in the same strategic sense as actually being fundamental to the workings of capitalism at the nation state. It's actually the church is strictly a relic of the Roman Empire, if we want to talk in those terms. So I don't think it has the same strategic importance as the nation state does. Now, the question of Marx and burgers, it is fairly central to my theme that fast food was important. But I'll come back in a minute on the question of towns. The question about the dissolution of the monasteries, you see, I agree with the comrade who said the question of the dissolution of the monasteries is an extremely important part of the process, but I don't think it's the initiation of the process of the development of capitalism in England. You see, there's no question that Henry's dissolution of the monasteries and his selling off of the gains which he got from the dissolution of the monasteries in order to pay for his war contributed enormously to the development of a new market in land in England. And that contributed very much, very helpfully, if you like, to the development of a capitalist land market. It also had the effect, also important for political development in England, that it kept the king, in fact, dependent on Parliament. And so you get the growth in England all through the 16th century of a Tudor monarchy that is still in a sort of interdependent relationship with a parliament that believes in its strength and so on, and is therefore very well placed in the 17th century to confront the king and finally to defeat the king in the 17th century. But I think you have to say about Henry's dissolution of the monasteries and what follows from that it helped the process enormously, but I think also you have to say the process of the development of capitalist agriculture had already begun before ever Henry VIII got to the throne. Now, that's to say, we really have to look back to the late 15th century rather than to the 16th century to see the beginnings of this socio-economic process in the countryside. Now, Nora quite rightly raises the question which I didn't talk about. If you notice, I had to cover some hundreds of years in 45 minutes, and I didn't talk enough about the question of political development. And it seems to me I completely agree, the English Revolution of the 17th century is absolutely a crucial moment in the whole process. It is England's bourgeois revolution. And I don't want to disagree with that at all. I don't question it. I think it's absolutely correct. But let's be clear what we're talking about. It isn't the beginning of the process of capitalist development in England. It's a process which is consolidated and enabled to carry on further. There is a struggle over the question of whether capitalism shall develop further in England and whether it shall consolidate, which is fought out in the 17th century. Not that the participants think necessarily in those terms, but looking back, that's the effect of the English Revolution of the 17th century. Of course, it is something else that has to be said. I'll come to the question of towns in a minute. One of the reasons why there is a need to put more stress than I did in my talk on the question of urban classes and urban struggles, and the revolutions, after all, are fundamentally urban phenomena. The key revolutions of the 17th and the 18th centuries, for example, are urban phenomena more than anything. Is, of course, where is the state? The central crystallization of a class society is its state form. They're in the cities, they're in the towns. That's where those decisive political battles are going to be fought. And sometimes maybe I need to make the separation more clearly, and certainly I think sometimes other comrades do, between general processes of socio-economic transformation, if you like, which in the case of the development of capitalism we can certainly trace back at least to the later 15th century, on the one hand, and processes of politics which are dependent on, interrelated with those, but don't have the same temporal dynamics, if you like. Now, the question of the towns, you see, I think David McNally put it absolutely right, because in the end, the towns, the feudal towns, and I think John Charlton making a distinction between feudal towns and capitalist towns, if that's what he was implying, is absolutely right. The feudal towns were fundamentally producers of luxury goods, not of goods for a mass market. And the thing that characterizes capitalist development, specifically capitalist development, is that is that it is the production of mass goods for the mass market. There's a difference. You can even say, I mean, it's a difference. You look at the production of sugar, for example. It begins as a luxury. The reason that sugar production becomes important in the development of capitalism is that as the expansion of sugar production lowers its price. Nora was very interested on this question yesterday in another meeting, that in fact it begins to enter into the consumption patterns of the working classes in Europe. By the middle of the 18th century, according to a book by an American, whose name I've forgotten just now, a very interesting Penguin book on sugar and the history of sugar, Sweetness and Power by Sidney Mintz. He shows how by the middle of the 18th century, there is... Mintz. Burgers, yes, sorry. By the middle of the 18th century, the average workman in England and his wife is already demanding sugar in their tea as a normal part of their diet and expecting it. This is now production in the West Indies for a mass market in Europe. It's quite different from the medieval town, which is fundamentally concerned with the production not of mass market goods, specialised production of that sort, but fundamentally producing for those who live off the countryside rather than live in it. Now, you see, John is right. New towns develop, and new kinds of towns develop. And he talks about, the examples he gave were from the end of the 15th century. See, the important question is not whether simply new kinds of town production develop, but whether they can continue to develop. The problem in parts of Europe is you get developments which are then stalled and which fall back, because agriculture has not been transformed, and the town population cannot expand and be sustained, and so on and so on. You can't get that continuing specialisation, continuing division of labour, which characterises the development of capitalism. Coarse enclosure occurs first around town. And there is an interaction between the development of the urban market. The urban specialised production can't occur unless there is a continued revolutionisation and development of agricultural production to feed that population. There's a growing interaction between agriculture and industry on a quite different basis under capitalism than we see under feudalism. Last question, well, I thought what Mick Brightman said about peasants was very, very interesting and very worth saying, because it does seem to me that partly because of battles that Marxists needed to fight in the past against pre-Marxists, there has been a tendency sometimes in Marxism to devalue the peasant struggle. You see, there's an absolutely correct insight in Marx, there's an absolutely correct insight in Lenin and in Trotsky, that peasants cannot overthrow the state and set up a state conforming to their own needs, because they are a rural class and the state and politics are concentrated in the town. They cannot, in that sense, the peasants cannot make the socialist revolution. They have not got the capacity to do so. But let's not, for that reason, forget that peasants fought enormous battles and had all sorts of capacities for political organisation, from the peasantry of England in the 14th century through to the Russian peasants in the 1905 revolution, for example, who were sufficiently good to change Lenin's the agrarian program of social democracy, because Lenin was so impressed with the level of peasant struggle in the Russian countryside, and he changed his mind about the peasantry. The great thing about Lenin, like all Marxists, I hope, is that they can learn to change their mind in the light of new experience. And we shouldn't forget the great experiences of peasant struggles of the past, merely because they are not the decisive class ultimately in the overthrow class society.